I think the first point I'd like to make is that humans are true omnivores. Argue with some colleagues who say, well, we eat too many carbohydrates. And I say we don't eat enough carbohydrates. We eat too much of the wrong carbohydrates.
Well, what you're taking the perspective that actually animal hunting was the most important source of food, and I think that we fundamentally disagree with that. Actually,
there is a concept called the protein toxicity hypothesis, and more recent evidence since our paper has been written is that once protein source of energy goes above 35% or so, it becomes toxic. Ketosis, or the production of ketones, is actually a state of metabolic dysfunction. It's a sort of an emergency system.
So very broadly speaking, what tends to give people a healthier gut and a happier life, and what tends to not?
The confusion is such that I'm sure I told Les this, and I don't know if it happened to you too, but after our 2016 paper, I had doctors emailing me from all across the world asking what they should be recommending their patients to eat.
Well, we often link being healthy with eating healthily. And we're all aware that most of the food we consume is quite different to the food that our ancient ancestors would have eaten. These days, many of us consume a lot of what's called processed food. That's led a lot of people striving to eat better to try and consume a recapitulation of our ancestors' diet. But exactly what did our ancestors eat? One argument put forward is that ancient humans were carnivores. That is, they ate mainly meat. So in terms of macronutrients, that's protein and fat. At the same time, progressively more people today are eating no meat at all. Is there some sort of ideal ratio of macronutrients that we should ingest to get our daily intake of calories? How much carbohydrate relative to protein, relative to fat is best? And how important are plants in our diet? On the one hand, most self-help books about diet will advocate eating a great deal of many different plant types, along with seeds and berries and mushrooms. On the other hand, meat proponents argue that when eaten in sufficient volume, meat pretty much covers your nutrient dietary needs. Recently, I discussed the arguments supporting the idea our ancestors were carnivores. This time, I have the great pleasure of talking to Professors Karen Hardy and Les Copeland, who have written about the likely dietary needs of our close relatives, the Neanderthals. What best suited them food-wise probably best suits us humans today. Well, Karen and Les, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me today from two corners of the world. Karen, you're based at the University of Glasgow, and Les, you're at the University of Sydney. So I've got some notes in front of me today because I want to make sure I discuss some specific points that arise in your excellent 2021 paper about sort of reconstructing the diet of Neanderthals. And I wanted to start with quoting one sentence. I think it's just one sentence from your paper, and that provides, I think, a nice segue into discussions. So you write, we propose that the use of plants, and in particular consumption of plant-based carbohydrates, was central to all aspects of human evolution, and that plants would have provided essential food and energy sources for fitness and successful reproduction for all hominin species. And arguably, this contrasts with the image that I think people will often have in their heads based on what they learnt at school and perhaps slightly old-fashioned textbooks or stories for children, have in their heads about sort of Stone Age man, if I can put it that way, who might be wearing, you know, the skin of an animal and wielding a spear, and maybe there's several of them sort of surrounding a mammoth or something like that. There's a big contrast between predominantly eating carbohydrates through the consumption of plants versus man, people, the hunters of megafauna. And I wondered if you might start off by telling us about why that contrast may have arisen.
Okay, so shall I start?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Karen.
All right then. So, yeah, thanks very much, Lewis. So I think that there's been a big revision over the last few years about our perception of our Paleolithic ancestors. Of course, Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens lived during the time called the Paleolithic, which stretched from around 3.4 million years ago up to about 11,000 years ago. So it's an enormous length of time. And what we do, Les and I and others, we study what's called later human evolution, which is probably from the Neanderthals onwards. Now, the Neanderthals appeared around 350,000 years ago. So that's just to provide a context. And Homo sapiens appeared first in North Africa as the first evidence around 200,000 years ago. Okay, so I think there are two reasons why there has been this perception of, let's say, our ancient Paleolithic ancestors as cavemen wielding spears and wearing animal hides. One of them is that there is a huge lack of evidence for anything else. And so plants very rarely survive because they obviously degrade very rapidly. You don't find them very often in deep time. We call it deep time Paleolithic sites because they simply disappear very quickly. I mean, Les will be able to tell you better than me how quickly plants degrade. But on the whole, unless they're carbonized, unless they've been burnt, they disappear. So they don't appear in the archaeological record at all. And the other one is this perception of these savages with spears and things, which was very much promoted, probably, sorry to say, but often by male researchers who didn't really conceptualize the whole picture, but like you said in your introduction, focused really on the young adolescent male and perhaps really focused rather a lot on how it would be to be a young adolescent male. So you're running around the landscape, chasing mammoths and wielding big spears and so on. But in fact, as you mentioned in your article, and as we discuss, that they really wouldn't have existed if it hadn't been for women reproducing and producing babies and so on. And of course, that changes the whole perception because actually, rather than focusing on what you might need, for a high protein burst of speed across the landscape, what you actually need, what is the bottleneck, what is the biggest requirement, most important requirement, is to be able to produce these humans, these people, which is of course women and their reproductive capacities. And so I think there's been a perceptive, a misperception, a misunderstanding of what actually was required in terms to produce these people. And so that has led to this really severe misunderstanding about what these are ancient Paleolithic hominins and human ancestors actually were. And so I would say that that's probably the starting point. So the lack of evidence for anything else, plus this perception based on the lack of evidence that has led to this really rather, let's say, misunderstanding about what the past was really, the Paleolithic past was really like. I'm sure Les has more specific things.
Yeah, look, I think, thanks, Karen. Karen is obviously the archaeological expert in our team. I'm more on the nutritional and biochemical side. I think the first point I'd like to make is that humans are true omnivores. So they must have plants in the diet, but also there is, and as Karen has said quite correctly, there's very much a lack of evidence for eating plants simply because of the nature of plants, whereas animal remains such as bones and those sorts of things do survive in the archaeological record. So that's been one of the reasons, as Karen pointed out, for the imbalance in the argument. But there is a concept called the protein toxicity hypothesis. And more recent evidence since our paper has been written is that once protein source of energy goes above 35% or so, it becomes toxic. The human metabolism just can't dispose of ammonia, which is produced from the breakdown of protein, which is highly toxic. But there's been some quite recent work by a number of research groups around the world, including some colleagues at the University of Sydney, that have analysed the diet of non-human primates as well as humans from all sorts of cultures. And the amount of protein in the diet remarkably is close to 30%. And this goes across a whole range of species and cultures. So you'd have to ask, what else did they eat? Because that seems to have been a pattern, and there was a selection for that diet amongst not just humans, but non-human primates and other animals as well. So I think that's an important point to make. I mean, there's a limit to how much protein that you can eat, and that leads into theories about obesity and disease, where if you have more protein, there's an effort to dilute it with eating other things, and that leads to excess calorie intake and so on. So, but that's a very complex area that I think is beyond the topic here. The other point that I think, and Karen alluded to this, and I certainly agree, and I think it's so obvious, that the modern humans have actually thrived, not just survived. And that depends very much on the effectiveness of reproduction in a whole range of aspects of that. And diet is, of course, a very, very important part of that. So I think that the lack of evidence for plant use is quite obviously explanatory. And also the need for foods other than protein. I mean, it could have also been fat, but we are talking about carbohydrates here because they were essential for brain development, for energy metabolism, for a whole range of things, and reproduction. So I guess that's the sort of basis for our hypothesis. And the more research comes out about modern nutrition, I think the more I think it supports what we put forward.
That's a great summary. So I want to summarize your summary if I can, to make sure that I've got this in my head. So in the past, possibly driven by the fact that most anthropologists, or all maybe, I don't know, were male and perhaps had a male focused point of view, and were perhaps particularly interested in what might be considered masculine things like hunting and carrying spears, coupled with the fact that fossil evidence didn't uncover, there wasn't much fossil evidence for the use of plants because plants don't typically fossilize or don't fossilize in great volume. This developed a picture of ancient man, the hunter, who predominantly fed himself and his family through the accumulation of meats, through hunting typically large prey. And this also, I guess this is my flourish added to this, but this also provides the opportunity for Victorian painters and so forth to paint large canvases with impressive, animals being felled and blood and guts and all this sort of business. Okay. And again, this focus on perhaps the male of the species misses a crucial another point, which is that arguably it is the females, particularly younger females, who are the limiting factor on a species' ability not only to survive but potentially to thrive being large numbers of offspring and potentially over a long period of time an increase in population size, because women can only have about one child a year at absolute maximum, whereas for men to father children the sky's the limit potentially. So for a number of reasons the focus may have been in the wrong direction, and in fact we need to be thinking more about what women, perhaps particularly young women, needed, and the fact that there's a lack of evidence for substantial plant use in the fossil records is not evidence that plants weren't consumed substantially. Moreover, in fact, there's evidence that a very protein-heavy diet is pathological, or at least suboptimal for the human physiology, the human gut system. And yes, you're right, Les. It probably gets a little bit too complicated to go into how overeating certain macronutrients can encourage hunger. But there's an argument to say that the body, when we eat, it doesn't just sample the number of calories we're taking on through various mechanisms, but it may sample the volume of different macronutrients that we consume. And so if we're consistently under consuming a key macronutrient, let's say, for example, carbohydrates, our body will make our cells continue to feel hungry in the hope that we will consume more food that has carbohydrates. So there's kind of a hunger for that under-consumed macronutrient. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, look, the main driver is probably protein, to get to that 30% protein level. And so if the diet is well under that, then the individual looks for food that in the effort of getting more protein, but in that process overconsumes. Yeah, I think the other thing that we should mention is that our hypothesis and dietary reconstruction doesn't exclude some form of hunting. I mean, there's no doubt that some hunting took place. It's just that we're saying that carbohydrates would have been very important. We can't quantify how much carbohydrate was consumed, but without carbohydrate, the species would not have survived or thrived. But obviously, protein is important too, and the most efficient way of getting protein would have been the occasional hunting of a beast and feasting on that.
I know your colleague David Raubenheimer. Is that right? Yes, a little bit.
I was speaking to him last week.
Okay, and actually Steve Simpson, I had the pleasure of bumping into about 18 months ago in London.
I know both of them well, yeah.
Yes, indeed. No, a lot better than I do, I think. So I have some understanding of the protein leverage hypothesis. Actually, it's interesting, as you mentioned, that seems to be around a response to a need for a certain level of protein, which suggests that protein is important. But then one would say, well, one doesn't need to ingest that much protein to satiate. So that's important. However, of course, when we eat an animal, it's not just protein. The other side to it, well, there may be a third side that I'll touch on later, but the other side to it is fat. So depending on, of course, the constitution of the animal, if one does eat an animal, it may be that actually way less than 50% of that is protein. I mean, I don't know, I should know the answer to this, but off the top of my head, it could be that if eating an animal, just the meat and viscera and fat of an animal for a meal, it might return a protein intake of about 30%, with the majority of the rest of it being fat. Is that possible?
Well, I think you're dealing with animals that were in the wild, and so they would have predominantly been lean. They would certainly have contained fat and also glycogen in the muscle, which is a carbohydrate, and in the liver. But glycogen is mobilized quite quickly unless the beast is eaten pretty well straight away. So yes, there would certainly be fat and carbohydrate in the form of glycogen, and there would also be things in the connective tissue and so on, and minerals, of course, minerals in the tissue, in the bone as well. Yeah, I mean, I think there is certainly a hypothesis, and Karen can comment on this, of people who were hunting predominantly to get fat. I mean, not to get fat in the sense of their body, but to obtain fat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that, to what Les said. Also, it's the chyme as well, which is probably quite important, because that's the partially digested contents of the stomach. And that certainly in high Arctic populations is an important, or is traditionally an important source of plant material. as well. And so as added to all these other things, there are other sources of useful nutrients that come from only eating animals, but however, probably not enough, as Liz has explained.
Well, one could make the argument then that actually, if our ancestors, and it's an if, I suppose, but if part of if a substantial number of the calories they obtained from an animal was from plant material that the animal had thus far partially digested in its digester or chyme, given that we don't do that in the modern day, or most of us don't do that when we eat meat, that we need to replace that carbohydrate that we would previously obtained from the chyme by eating non-digested by animals carbohydrates. Is there something to that?
Well, what you're taking the perspective that actually animal hunting was the most important source of food, and I think that we fundamentally disagree with that. Actually, I think that probably plant collecting is the most reliable source of food daily, on a daily basis. Ethnographically, this is pretty well recorded very, very broadly across the world, that it's the collectors who provide the day-to-day food, and the hunters go off and sometimes come back with an amazing mammoth, or the modern equivalent. But I think that actually, I think you need to twist the whole thing right around and say, actually, yes, okay, of course they ate meat, yes, of course they hunted and so on, but I don't think to suggest that the need for plants somehow replaced the need to eat chyme really works at all, actually. I think that the chyme in very high Arctic populations where there is a lack of meat, and I have to say that I spent some time in Mongolia last summer and had an amazing meal that consisted only of animal, and included, obviously, these are grazed animals, so they're domesticated, but they're not eating anything except for grass, and that did include sausage-like bits of chyme and so on. And they don't, in Mongolia, in the steppes in Mongolia, they don't eat an awful lot of plant food, and so that it was definitely a part of the entire meal, in the entire what they eat. But I think you just need to maybe change everything around a little bit and look at plants themselves and forget the meat for a while. I think the meat was probably something that is an add-on to the fundamental plants. And also, I would say, in earlier human evolution, the focus really is very strongly on plants.
Yeah, and I think we need to go back to what we were saying before. I mean, during pregnancy, women need a lot more carbohydrate because they're actually nourishing to people. And then similarly in lactation. And those are very important for the proliferation of the species. So it's not just, you can, if you're dealing with the average 70-kilogram male, well, maybe you can make some assumptions there. But I think they don't work very well for the female population during reproductive ages, which are very important for the survival of the species.
Which we mentioned is potentially the key point, the potential bottleneck, and so in a sense they're the most important, in inverted commas, for the thriving as a species. You can imagine you could have some pretty battered, beaten up males, but as long as they can do their side of the business, sort of thing, it comes down to the women to be able to reproduce repeatedly for a species to thrive.
I think it's also an exponential function that the more reproduction, more infants that are produced, the larger the gene pool, and that in itself aids the population to grow and thrive, because that way you don't have inbreeding and the concentration of adverse recessive traits. So once it gets to that stage we're dealing in ancient times with much more sparsely distributed populations, so gene pool for reproduction would have been limited. So I think we haven't done any calculations or work on that, but I think that's a consideration as well.
Let's talk then a bit more, if we can, about the carbohydrate needs, or the glucose needs perhaps, for pregnant and then lactating women. I think your argument is that this section of the population in particular really does need a relatively high carbohydrate diet. Is that the case?
Well, we've done some calculations in the paper about how much additional glucose, and it does come from glucose in the bloodstream, the mother's bloodstream, is needed to nourish the fetus, and that's in addition to the basic amount to nourish brain and maintain respiratory activity through red blood cells, which also use glucose almost exclusively. So I think that's probably an equivalent amount, maybe even more than the base amount. And I don't recall the number that we put for estimates for during lactation, but of course that is also, so it's really almost, well, be more than a doubling, I would say, of the base requirement for maintaining brain activity, red blood cell activity. Kidney is another tissue that has a demand. So I think we calculate. Yeah,
sorry,
Karen probably got to.
Well, no, I mean, I think there's a fundamental issue here between thrive and survive, or survive and thrive. We did some calculations on, for example, low birth weight and so on. You know, you can produce low birth weight, not optimal children, okay, babies, with a very low carbohydrate diet, but that has an enormous impact on their future and on their IQ and all sorts of other things. Now, people quite often just simply dismiss the Neanderthals as a non-successful species, but Neanderthals actually are far more successful in terms of longevity than Homo sapiens at the moment. We're still struggling to get 200,000 years and currently racing towards our own self-destruction, whereas the Neanderthals lasted 350,000 years and then actually interbred with us, so you could argue they're still here. So I think it would be a very great misconception. There is a great misconception about Neanderthals. I don't think they survived. I think they thrived. And I think in order for them to have thrived, they produced optimum children, infants. And that has a huge impact, implication in terms of their carbohydrate consumption and their diet in general. And yeah, I don't know what you think, Les, but I think that that's pretty well established, really.
I think that's right. And I think, you know, it's not just the number of births, because it's the number of births who survive to their own reproductive age. Yeah. And that's an important, it's sort of a flow-on effect, that if a child is born that's not healthy, or and also stillbirths, we don't have much information. Karen may know about that as well. But I think that these births have to survive through to reproductive age and be well enough to produce healthy children themselves.
Yeah, I would also just say also about the brain size. I don't know if it's not widely known really that, but perhaps it is widely known that Neanderthals actually had larger brain capacity, CC capacity, than we have. However, probably what is less known is that early Homo sapiens also had, and that our brain capacity is quite dramatically declining and has been doing so for some period of time. So we're very suboptimal now. We kind of see ourselves as the kind of height of success, and I would say it was slightly not quite so straightforward as that. So we're currently not looking like we're going to survive for the length of time that Neanderthals and even earlier species like Homo erectus survived. They survived for around 1 million years. But also there's a lot of arguments as to why our brain capacity is diminishing. One of these is that we're simply not as intelligent as our ancestors, which is very possible considering what they achieved. There are other possible arguments as well, in that our brains have simply become more efficient and all sorts, and we need different bits of the brain and so on. But I think it's really important to stress this point that the brain is incredibly important, and that it requires a huge amount of really specific nutrients, as they said, 20% of glucose. 20%, I think, isn't it? Of
I think 25% of the resting energy of the the body is required for brain.
But you're saying, Liz, that it's higher than that typically for gestating or lactating women.
Well, that's just for brain. Yeah. For other organs, there's you know, the use of glucose for energy to drive metabolism and so on is quite quite a different story. I mean, we're looking at very complex.
Now I can hear. Sorry, Les. Beg your pardon. Yes, that's very important. I think absolutely key. However, I can hear in my head certain individuals would be saying, ask them about ketones. Ketones. What about ketones? Aren't they an alternative? Isn't the human body capable of using ketones? We have some evidence for that. Maybe humans are actually better than a lot of other species who've been investigated in terms of using ketones. And in fact, I think, although I don't know the details about this, and perhaps I should, some people would argue there are advantages to the body of using ketones over using glucose.
Well, like the brain can use, I mean, glucose is the preferred substrate. And if it's not available, there is ability to use ketones. And I don't think there is, it certainly can be a short-term mechanism to provide energy for the brain, but we're talking about long-term, I mean, in terms of many years, because the lifespan of a human is many years. I don't think there's much evidence available as to how a brain that is being nourished by ketones appears after 5, 10, 20 years. I mean, certainly over a short time, that is a possibility. But glucose is the preferred substrate. But of course, we're very adaptable, and there are always alternatives. If during starvation, if for some reason the gathering isn't very successful and the hunting isn't successful, we have a mechanism to be able to survive a period of starvation, and that involves using ketones. But the mechanism really rectifies itself when glucose becomes available through the diet.
So the argument would be we can use ketones. Sorry, Karen, I thought we can use ketones, but it's the fallback option when we're in trouble. It's not the preferred situation. Sorry, Karen.
Yeah.
Short term. Yeah, so there was a couple of things I'd like to say on that. One is that I have no idea, because I've actually never thought about it until now, but the effect of ketosis on reproduction. So can reproducing females actually produce viable infants if they use this gluconeogenetic pathway? And I don't know that, Les, you might be able to know the answer. And also, something that is often quoted to us is the high Arctic populations, who obviously had a very high animal consumption. Now, the high Arctic populations right around the high Arctic, that's into Siberia and Canada and Alaska and so on, actually had they have a specific gene that allows them, it's called the CPT1A gene, I think this is correct, Les, and that allows them to be, let's say, more permanently in the state of gluconeogenesis, but it has negative effects. Okay, but the rest of us don't have this gene. Okay, but this, even the population that does have this gene, they have enlarged livers, they have liver health problems related to their liver constantly, and they have a very low reproductive rate. And so it's, as Les is saying, it's an emergency response to a difficult environment, that they've been there long enough to actually make this adaptation to it. But even with the adaptation, that's possibly as near as we can get to seeing what would be a long-term population on ketosis. But as I say, they have actually got a specific adaptation to that.
Yeah. Look, I think that's very right. It's important to consider that there are populations that live in inhospitable environments, and there are sufficient genetic variants that are selected for if there's selection pressure. I mean, the best example of that is lactose tolerance. The original situation was humans, after they reach adolescence, are essentially lactose intolerant, but populations that lived in areas where there was limited sunlight during winter and other habitat situations, there was variants selected for that were able to actually metabolize lactose in milk. And milk was a good source of calcium and also vitamin D. So that was a situation where there was a selection in favour of a variant that was at that time not the main genetic makeup. And the same thing with these Arctic populations. There are variants that allow for more gluconeogenesis, more use of ketones, but they do have consequences. I mean, ketosis is also associated with a lowering of the normal blood pH, and so the acidification is actually quite harmful.
Could we turn to talking about a couple of anatomical, physiological fundamentals, which seem to suggest that while human beings do eat plants, maybe they're not particularly predisposed to eating plants. I want to see what you've done. I mean, I know these are things you'll have come across before. So the first thing would be a reduction in the size of human masticatory teeth. So the molars, basically, for chewing. A reduction in the size of those compared to our primate ancestors, which would suggest that we're less into chewing and more into ripping.
Yeah, there's a very important thing that you've got to consider there, and that's cooking. Now, you mentioned it right in the beginning of your introduction about consumption of processed food. We don't eat very much unprocessed food. We eat a few things like bananas and so on, but any food that's cooked has been processed. What we're talking about that's harmful in the modern diet is ultra-processed food, food that's been extruded or cooked to a very high temperature and so on. But cooking in the when it emerged, Karen will give me give you a better answer of when that was. I know it's a bit of controversial, but certainly Homo sapiens cooked food, and that made things like starch and hence glucose, and also the nutrients in things like meat and other plant material much more accessible. So you've got to factor in the cooking story, which came quite a long time ago.
Okay, so I'd just like to say a couple of things there. Ripping meat is probably as hard work as ripping leaves, or perhaps even harder. So I think that this business of the teeth relating to only eating meat is probably wrong. Secondly, as Les says, the cooking hypothesis is when cooking actually started is still open to conjecture. There is a theory that cooking is very ancient indeed, and actually probably over 1.5 million years old. There are very, very small amounts of evidence for fire, let's say controlled fire at this period of time, but there's very small amount of evidence for anything at that period of time. This is still an open hypothesis. The actual evidence for more consistent use of fire kicks in around 400,000 years ago with our pre-Neanderthal, pre-Homo sapiens ancestors, Homo erectus. But it continues to be sporadic, but that is because there simply is not the evidence for fire, because there simply isn't the evidence for an awful lot, like there is no evidence for plants. But I think Les is absolutely right. I think processing food outside the mouth probably has had an awful lot of or very high implications on our use of teeth and the shape of our teeth and so on. And so this argument that and to be honest, ripping, I'm not really sure. I've never really understood this business about, ripping plants is more difficult than ripping chunks of meat of an animal in terms of the type of teeth. But I think that there's an awful lot of other issues and factors that need to be taken into consideration there.
And similarly, sorry, not similarly, but associated. Now I've got some notes on this here. Apparently, the human colon, and to be clear, so for here, the human colon is where fiber fermentation by gut bacteria occurs. So in other words, breaking down, plant-based fibers along with other things happens in the human colon. Okay, and apparently that is 77% smaller, while the small intestine, which predominantly uptakes sugars along with fats and proteins, so that's where you get the uptake of macronutrients, that's much longer than in chimpanzees. Now, of course, chimpanzees are only one relative, but nonetheless, that in isolation suggests that the human body is less interested in breaking down fibers and more interested in taking up macronutrients, which includes carbohydrates, but also includes fats and proteins.
Yeah, look, I would challenge that. I think that the evidence in the last 20 years for the importance of the gut microbiome in all aspects of wellness of the host and health is becoming so strong. I mean, there's lots of interaction along the gut-brain axis, so the microbiome affects brain activity and cognitive function and a whole lot of other things. I mean, this is a huge area. It would have been really interesting to be exploring the gut microbiome of some of our ancestors. But certainly in modern times, fibre is the main food for the gut microbiome. There will be a gut microbiome regardless of what food is presented, but I don't think we know much about what the effect of eating only protein is on the gut microbiome. But certainly there's evidence that a high carbohydrate environment, in other words, high carbohydrates for gut microbiome fermentations, is much less inflammatory than a high protein environment, because proteins are broken down into toxic amines, which produce all sorts of side effects, whereas the fibre, carbohydrate, non-starch carbohydrates are fermented and are a major source of short-chain fatty acids, acetate, propionate and butyrate, of which butyrate has multiple physiological functions in controlling aspects of physiology. It's absorbed across the gut wall, and so it has a very important regulatory function. But more and more discoveries are being made on interactions between the gut microbiome and health and wellness. So I think this is an area that will be explored more in the coming time, and maybe that is something that can be used to project back, if you like, on what might have happened with different diets in ancient times. But it's an evolving story. And it may also be that while the colon is smaller, the efficiency of the microbiome may be much greater. And I think you not only have to look at the length of it, but the diversity of the microbial population and its redundancy in terms of if one species is knocked out, what else can take its place? I mean, there's a whole lot of issues there.
So in summary, from that point, it's less about the size or length of the different parts of the gut, and more focus should be put on the microbiota within those sections of the gut.
Yeah, the pig digestive system is probably regarded as a good model because pigs are also omnivores, and they are used a lot in digestive studies when it's not possible to use primates obviously for ethical reasons, and also can't do those experiments with humans. But there is quite a lot of work on pigs as a model system for the human digestive system.
So to pull all this together, well, no, actually not to pull it all together, but to kind of wrap things up. I think modern dietary guidelines suggest something like it, just in terms of macronutrients. So this is very broad. Something like calories should be attained or are best obtained by about 50% carbohydrates. And I can never remember whether it's 30% protein and 20% fat or 20% protein and 30% fat, but maybe that doesn't matter too much. But, about half carbohydrates and then a mix of protein and fat for the other side.
Yeah. Now, the
Go on, Luke.
important thing to consider is the type of carbohydrates.
Okay.
I always like to ketosis, or the production of ketones, is actually a state of metabolic dysfunction. It's a sort of an emergency system. I argue with some colleagues who say, well, we eat too many carbohydrates. And I say we don't eat enough carbohydrates. We eat too much of the wrong carbohydrates. We eat too much highly processed starch, which triggers a whole lot of metabolic dysfunction, which leads to ultimately things like type 2 diabetes, obesity, and so on. We don't eat enough of the non-starch carbohydrates, the food for the microbiota. The nutritionists recommend that we eat about 35 to 40 grams of dietary fibre a day. Some reckon that it should be almost double that at least. The actual average consumption is about 12 to 15%. So we're way short of what is a good nutritional recommendation. But we eat generally, in eating highly processed foods, too much rapidly digestible starch, which causes all sorts of problems.
Okay, so that seems in a sense paradoxical. So rapidly digestible starch, that sounds good in the sense that we can digest it, right? Rather than that we can't digest it.
No, because what we don't digest goes to food for the microbiome.
Right. So
and
eating
resistant starch is a very good food for the fermentative bacteria. Now, you might say, well, how did this apply in ancient times? Well, they cooked, but their cooking process was nowhere near as efficient in converting the starch. They cooked it to the point of, well, we could propose to the point of digestibility, but not to the point where it was so rapidly digested that it caused the rapid insulin response and so on. But that's a speculation at this stage.
But eating the right sort of starches is crucial, not just for us, but for the microbiota in our bodies in our guts that will digest or break down the food for us. So it's kind of, we're feeding them as well as ourselves.
Yeah, look, the important thing is to slow down digestion. And foods that have structure, one of the things that really controls the rate of digestion is the structure of the food. So if the starch is entrapped in a matrix of cell wall polysaccharides, the digestive enzymes don't get to it quickly, and so there's a whole series of lectures I can talk about that, and I think it's getting a bit too complex. But yeah, it's the proportion of rapidly digested and slowly digested and non-digested carbohydrates that's critical, and that's related to the burden of disease.
So does that equate? If it doesn't, that's fine. But I'm sort of being serious and well, I'm being serious here. So I found, as I mentioned to you at the start of the discussion before we started recording, that if I eat breakfast cereals with milk each day, that doesn't do me any good. I can get away with it every now and then, but I can't. Does that relate to this issue of starch and the right sort of starches in inverted commas?
Well, it depends on what breakfast cereals you eat. If they've been cooked by extrusion, they will have there's fibre added, of course, but if they're cooked by extrusion, they will have a lot of rapidly digestible starch, and you can tell that by the label, what's labelled on the packet, or their GI rating, glycemic index rating, and you'll see a lot of breakfast foods have a high GI rating. There are other breakfast foods that are not as processed as much. For example, things like steel-cut oats or traditional oats, not quick oats, that are much more slowly digested, and they have a low GI. So it's a matter of looking at labels, which of course is complex for difficult for the average consumer.
But actually, low GI, I think, used to be associated with not getting a boost of sugars into your body too quickly, the low GI. But you're saying that low GI is also associated with the microbiota.
Well, low GI generally implies that there's a fair amount of fibre in there or structure, but you're still going to get plenty of starch that's digested. You know, it's if you've got a GI of around 50, then probably half of the starch is there to provide you energy, to allow you to be active. But you've got some fair amount of fibre that will go through to the gut microbiome.
So of course, everyone who's listening will be thinking about their own diets. I mean, a lot of people are listening because they're interested in the intellectual pursuit of understanding, you know, what our ancestors ate and what we're evolutionarily designed to eat and so on and so forth. But of course, people are interested in their own health and what they're doing. So are you able to magically distill in just a few sentences what you perhaps have lectured a whole course on in the past in terms of what people should eat? So you're making a very important point. It's not just about eating a relatively high carbohydrate diet, but about what those carbohydrates are. So very broadly speaking, what tends to give people a healthier gut and a happier life, and what tends to not?
Well, more fibre. We should be eating more fibre than we do, because that will promote a healthy microbiota, and they will outcompete the ones that are potentially harmful. I think basically avoiding ultra-processed foods. And we need protein as well. And we probably need protein with a good amino acid composition. So if you're going to get protein from plants, it's not just from one source. Legumes and cereals make a pretty good combination because they're both deficient in certain amino acids, but they complement each other. So I reckon our ancestors would probably have eaten a reasonably healthy diet. Wasn't over processed. It was cooked. It was a mixture of a lot of plant material, a lot of roots and tubers and other plants that were available, fruits probably, and the occasional beast that they were lucky enough to catch. I don't know if Karen would comment on that. But...
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Les is quite. I'm very interested, Les, to know what you have for breakfast.
Well, I can tell you, it's a lot of different types of cereal that are chosen to have a fibre, some nuts which contain a whole lot of things, and also some fruit, banana, and a whole lot of berries to give nice red and purple colours. And that's my breakfast.
Yeah, that sounds pretty
dinner.
Well, actually, I think that's, well, it doesn't last me till dinner, but anyway. But I think that's the other point that Les has just raised, actually, is the diversity as well. A broader range of different, particularly plant foods and so on. So it's the range of food as well as the type of food, or the range of plant food as well, isn't it? I think, Les.
Yeah. And the food that our ancestors would have eaten wouldn't have been highly processed. You know, no. It seems to me, and I'm going to get myself into hot water here, but the production of sort of fake meat products from plant protein seems to me a complete contradiction, because why not eat the plants? Why not eat lentils and chickpeas and so on as they are? They're perfectly healthy. They're excellent sources of carbohydrates, both starch and non-starch carbohydrates that our gut bacteria like. Why do we smash them up and make them into fake hamburgers and fake sausages? So to me, it seems totally counterintuitive. It's going to enrage some people, but
Excellent. Nothing wrong with that. You're a long way away from most of them anyway. But no, it's an interesting point. And I guess, of course, the answer, not that this necessarily makes it right or wrong, is that there's a kind of cultural interest in eating burgers in a bun, right? And people want to join in. But I very much take your point that,
yeah, look, it's more complex than that, obviously.
sure. But it's an interesting point, well made. Well, look, on that interesting, mildly controversial note, thank you very much, both of you, Karen and Les, for your time. That's been super interesting, fascinating for me and others to hear. Lots to think about, lots to chew on, if I can put it that way. And I, for one, will certainly be having a further think about what I'm eating. Well, not only for my breakfast, which is changing at the moment, as I've mentioned, but my other meals as well, of which I eat several still every day. So thank you very much indeed. I imagine most people get the idea, whether they can resist or not, that they probably shouldn't be eating too much hyper ultra processed food. It's not that clear, is it, to them, I think, what's best in terms of unprocessed food and how to balance it out. Is that our fault?
Well, look, yeah, I think it is. It's partly also the marketing. I think that, there's no such thing as unprocessed food. Well, I take that back. Obviously, a banana is unprocessed, but it's the extent to which it's been processed. And Karen and I started talking about this 20 years ago, and our thinking was really converged together on this. It just doesn't make sense. The sort of dogma about our ancestors being only meat eaters, because it just didn't make sense. I think the lack of evidence for plant use has been critical. I think that's a big thing to overcome.
There is a lot of confusion out there for the public about what is best nutritionally.
The confusion is such that I'm sure I told Les this, and I don't know if it happened to you too, but after our 2016 paper, I had doctors emailing me from all across the world asking what they should be recommending their patients to eat. Mad. But that shows how, with the level of absolute lack of understanding of what was going on, of what does go on, and the diet and everything into today.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I do think somehow I'm going to say, well, it's not really me. It might be you. It's the nutrition professional, shall we say? Somehow we haven't done over the last 50 years a particularly good job of either working out what we should be eating and or communicating what we should be eating. I mean, that's fair of me to say?
It's the communication. And
but hang on, Les. But hang on. Can I just push on that, because when I was younger, it was all about cut down fat. Now, I know there's details about saturated fat and unsaturated, fine, but it was cut down the fat. Now it seems to be, well, actually, up to a point, fat's fine. Now we need to cut down on the sugar. I mean, those are huge about turns on the fundamentals of what people are being told they should be consuming.
The other thing that's not mentioned, of course, is portion size. The calorie intake, total calorie intake, has increased from about, I think Britain and Australia are very similar in this. I did some research on this because I gave a talk on it not long ago. For males, about 2,500 calories to 3,200 average, and females about 2,200 to about just under 3,000. So, the average are eating enough calories to support the activity of an elite athlete. And
so it's the amount, yes, of course.
And so you can see obesity levels rise in the two countries you mentioned, very markedly, very markedly.
They've gone up from about but less than 10% to close to over 30%.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
wow.
And you were right about the fat message, because medical professions said you should cut down on fats. So people, according to this protein leverage hypothesis, were eating more, and what they were eating was highly processed carbohydrates, highly processed starch in the form of snack foods and all of that. And that's where the obesity came in.